Hey there, how's it going? Thanks for joining me today. Whether you're relaxing at home, on your commute, or winding down for the evening, I'm really glad you're here. You know, I've been thinking about something that absolutely blows my mind every time I consider it. What if I told you that we're living in just one possible version of history? That there's an alternate timeline where everything we know about the 20th century is completely different? Where German flags fly over Paris? Where the British Empire collapsed decades earlier than it did, and where the entire map of the world looks nothing like what you learned in school? Here's the crazy part. This isn't some wild science fiction fantasy. We're talking about a world that came within a hair's breadth of actually happening. I'm talking about what would have occurred if Germany had won World War I. And trust me, when you hear how close this actually came to reality, you're going to be absolutely stunned. Picture this for a second. It's November 11th, 1918. But instead of the armistice we know from history, imagine something completely different unfolding. Picture German General Ludendorff standing in a muddy field near the Belgian town of Mons, accepting the surrender of British Field Marshal Haig. Think about that moment. The roles completely reversed from what actually happened. Now, I know what you're thinking. How is that even possible? Well, let me paint you a picture of this alternate world, because once you see it, you'll understand just how dramatically different our planet could have been. Step into 1919, but not the 1919 you know from history books. Walk down the Champs, Élysée in Paris, but instead of French tricolour flags, you see the black, white, and red banners of Imperial Germany fluttering in the breeze. French refugees are streaming south towards Spain by the thousands, carrying whatever possessions they can manage. The cafes that should be celebrating victory are boarded up or serving German officers who speak in crisp military German about their plans for reorganizing conquered territories. Cross the English Channel, if you can get passage, because German submarines still patrol these waters, and witness something that would have been unthinkable to people of that era. The British pound, once the strongest currency on earth, has crashed to half its pre-war value. Prime Minister David Lloyd George faces angry crowds in London demanding his resignation. People are shouting about how Britain never should have entered the war, how the government has bankrupted the nation and destroyed the empire for nothing. But here's where it gets really wild. Travel to Berlin, and you'll find Kaiser Wilhelm II standing on his palace balcony, addressing massive crowds that stretch for blocks in every direction. This is no longer just the capital of Germany, ITAA. It's become the new centre of European power. The Kaiser, who in our timeline fled to the Netherlands in disgrace, is now the most powerful monarch on earth. In our world, we barely remember Kaiser Wilhelm, except as a historical footnote, the emperor who lost the Great War. But in this alternate timeline, he's the man who reshaped the entire global order. German engineers are completing massive infrastructure projects that connect Berlin to Baghdad. German banks are financing reconstruction across Europe. German scientists are pushing the boundaries of technology with unlimited government funding. Now, you might wonder how different things could really be. After all, it's still the same countries, the same people, right? Wrong. The ripple effects of German victory would have been absolutely staggering. Let's start with the map itself. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, which collapsed in our timeline, stretches unbroken from Vienna all the way to the Black Sea. Instead of breaking apart into smaller nations like Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia, it remains intact, held together by German military advisors and economic support. Hungarian nobles still rule from Budapest. Austrian bureaucrats still administer from Vienna. But now they do so under the protective umbrella of German power. Head east, and you'll find Russia in a completely different state. Instead of the unified Soviet Union we know from history, the former Russian Empire is carved up into multiple pieces. There's a German-sponsored Ukrainian state controlling some of the most fertile farmland in Europe. There's a rump Bolshevik government that barely controls the area around Moscow, with Lenin and his followers essentially trapped in a geographic prison. And controlling everything from the Ural Mountains to Vladivostok, you have General Wrangel's White Forces, still fighting their civil war, but now with massive German support flowing through the Baltic ports. Here's something that would have shocked people at the time. The Ottoman Empire isn't just surviving, it's thriving. In our timeline, the sick man of Europe finally collapsed after World War I, carved up between Britain and France. But in this alternate world, German intervention saves the Ottoman Sultan. Turkish forces are preparing to reclaim territories they lost in the Balkan Wars. German engineers are working around the clock to complete the Berlin to Baghdad railway that will transform global trade routes forever. But let me tell you about the moment that really drives home how different this world would be. Picture the morning of November 11th, 1918, unfolding in a way that would have seemed impossible to anyone living through our version of history. Instead of German representatives signing an armistice in Marshal Foch's railway car in the forest of Compiègne, you have German stormtroopers holding positions just 30 miles from Paris. The Spring Offensive, AT, Germany's last desperate gamble in our timeline, ATTH, has purred as if a feared succeeded beyond anyone's wildest dreams. French government officials are fleeing to Bordeaux in absolute panic, just like they did during the Franco-Prussian War almost 50 years earlier. Meanwhile, the Royal Navy's Grand Fleet, the pride of British sea power, sits anchored and completely impotent in Scapa Flow. Why? Because the most successful submarine campaign in naval history has cut off their fuel supplies. German U-boats have accomplished what no enemy of Britain had managed for centuries. They've effectively blockaded the British Isles. Now, here's what makes this scenario so mind-bending. This isn't some fantasy alternative where everything magically goes Germany's way. This is based on historical analysis showing that German victory required changes in just 11 specific decisions made between August 1914 and March 1918. 11 decisions. That's it. Think about the implications of that for a second. The entire course of the 20th century, everything from the rise and fall of the Soviet Union to the Holocaust to the Cold War to the development of nuclear weapons, all of it hinged on 11 specific moments where history could have gone either way. You want to know something that'll really blow your mind? Recent computer modelling shows that German victory was actually more probable than Allied victory. We're living in what mathematicians would call the less likely timeline. How's that for perspective? But let's get back to this incredible alternate world and really explore what daily life would have looked like. Walk through the streets of London in this timeline, and you'd see bread lines that make the rationing of our World War I look like a minor inconvenience. British food imports have dropped from 12 million tonnes to just 4 million tonnes. Industrial production has collapsed as workers weaken from malnutrition. The city that once controlled global commerce is now struggling to feed its own population. Travel to Berlin, and you'd witness the opposite transformation. German industrial production has increased by 60%, boosted by captured French and Belgian factories. The German mark has become Europe's strongest currency, while the British pound loses its role as the global reserve currency. German banks are financing reconstruction projects from Warsaw to Baghdad, creating an economic sphere of influence that stretches across 2 continents. Here's where it gets really fascinating from an American perspective. President Wilson's 14 points, his idealistic plan for reshaping the post-war world, become completely irrelevant. Germany is the one dictating peace terms now. The United States, having entered the war only to see their allies defeated, faces a massive crisis of confidence. Isolationist sentiment surges as Americans question whether European entanglements serve any purpose whatsoever. But here's the kicker. German-American communities, who were persecuted and harassed throughout the war in our timeline, suddenly find themselves celebrating in the streets of Milwaukee and Cincinnati. Think about the psychological whiplash that would have created. One day you're hiding your German ancestry to avoid suspicion. The next day, your homeland has become the dominant world power. The economic transformations would have been equally staggering. With access to French iron ore, Belgian industrial capacity, and Russian wheat, Germany becomes an economic superpower virtually overnight. The completion of the Berlin to Baghdad railway creates trade routes that bypass British-controlled shipping entirely. Goods flow from Hamburg to Basra in just 8 days, fundamentally altering global commerce patterns. Now, you might be wondering about the rest of the world. How would this German victory have affected places like India, Africa, or the Americas? The British Empire begins its death spiral decades earlier than in our timeline. With the Royal Navy's prestige shattered and British finances in ruins, independence movements explode across the colonial territories. The Indian National Congress, emboldened by British weakness, declares independence in January 1919. And here's something that would have shocked Gandhi's followers. Instead of passive resistance, German weapons smuggled through Ottoman ports enable active rebellion. In Egypt, the Wafd Party expels British administrators and declares an alliance with the Ottoman Empire. The Suez Canal, that vital lifeline of British imperial power, closes to British shipping. South Africa's Boer population, still bitter from their defeat in the Boer War, rises in armed rebellion with covert German support. General Jan Smuts finds himself fighting a three-way civil war between British loyalists, Boer Republicans, and African independence movements. Picture the psychological impact this would have had on people living through these events. For generations, the British Empire had seemed permanent, unchangeable, as natural as the rising sun. Suddenly, within the span of just a few years, this global colossus is crumbling. Colonial administrators who once ruled with absolute confidence find themselves packing their belongings and fleeing territories their grandfathers had conquered. Meanwhile, in German East Africa, something unprecedented in colonial history begins to unfold. With unlimited resources and no British interference, German administrators implement massive development projects. The Tanganyika Railway extends inland to connect with Belgian Congo lines, creating a transcontinental African network. German pharmaceutical companies establish research centers in tropical climates, accelerating medical discoveries that save millions of lives across Africa and Asia. Here's what really gets me excited about studying this alternative timeline, SIA. It shows us how contingent and fragile our assumptions about historical inevitability really are. We tend to think of the British Empire's dominance as something that lasted for centuries and collapsed gradually. But this scenario shows us that global power structures can shift with stunning rapidity when the underlying conditions change. The technological implications alone would have been revolutionary. German chemical industries, already world leaders in 1914, receive massive government investment and captured Allied research. By 1925, German laboratories are producing synthetic rubber, advanced plastics, and pharmaceutical compounds that won't appear in our timeline until the 1940s. And get this, the Zeppelin works, freed from wartime bombing raids that never happened, develops passenger airships capable of crossing the Atlantic in just 36 hours. Imagine traveling from Berlin to New York faster than modern commercial flights, and you're getting a sense of how different transportation technology could have evolved. But perhaps the most mind-blowing development would have been in space technology. German rocket pioneer Hermann Oberth receives unlimited government funding beginning in 1920. His team, working at a secret facility in East Prussia, launches the world's first liquid-fueled rocket in 1923, 4 years before Robert Goddard's experiments in Massachusetts. By 1930, German rockets are regularly reaching altitudes exceeding 50 miles, laying groundwork for space exploration decades ahead of our timeline. Think about that for a moment. We could have been looking at German astronauts reaching the moon in the 1940s or 50s, rather than the American moon landing in 1969. The entire space race could have unfolded with completely different players and dramatically different timing. Now, I know this might sound like I'm painting an overly rosy picture of German victory, but here's the thing. This alternative timeline would have created its own serious problems and tensions. Different doesn't necessarily mean better. The competition between German-led Central Europe and an American-dominated Western Hemisphere would have created new forms of international rivalry. Trade wars might have replaced military conflicts as Germany and America competed for markets in South America and Asia. The development of synthetic alternatives to American cotton and tobacco would have devastated southern agriculture, potentially creating economic conditions that fueled different forms of political extremism in the United States. Instead of the racial tensions that actually developed in our timeline, you might have seen economic nationalism and anti-German sentiment reaching dangerous levels. What fascinates me most about this whole scenario is how it challenges our basic assumptions about the 20th century. We think of certain developments as inevitable: the rise of democracy, the spread of human rights, the growth of international law. But studying this alternative timeline reveals that none of these were predetermined. They emerged from specific circumstances that could have developed very differently. And here's something that might surprise you. Without the devastating population losses and economic trauma that historically fueled extremist movements, German society in this timeline avoids some of the darkest chapters we associate with German history. The Social Democratic Party, strengthened by victory rather than humiliated by defeat, implements gradual democratic reforms that transform the German Empire into something resembling a constitutional monarchy. Women gain voting rights in 1920, while labor unions negotiate directly with government ministries to establish worker protections that become models for industrial democracy worldwide. The demographic changes prove equally dramatic. Without the massive population losses of the war's final year, Europe retains an additional 3 million young men who marry, have children, and pursue careers. Immigration patterns reverse completely. Instead of Europeans fleeing to America, German prosperity attracts immigrants from around the world. Jewish refugees from Eastern European pogroms find safety and opportunity in German cities. Italian workers seeking higher wages migrate north to German factories. Even Chinese laborers, recruited for African development projects, establish communities in Hamburg and Bremen that transform German cuisine and culture. As we wrap up this journey through the world that never was, I want you to think about something profound. Everything I've described, every detail of this alternative timeline, represents roads not taken in our own history. These weren't distant possibilities but near realities, separated from our timeline by margins so thin they defy comprehension. The delayed telegram that could have changed King Albert's response, the submarine campaign that nearly succeeded in starving Britain into submission, the spring offensive that came terrifyingly close to breaking through Allied lines. Each of these moments carried the weight of worlds, and understanding them helps us appreciate just how fragile and contingent our current reality really is. But here's what gets me most excited about exploring these alternative histories. They don't just show us what could have been, they illuminate what is. By understanding how different the world could have been, we gain deeper appreciation for the forces that shaped the world we actually inhabit. So the next time you see a map of Europe, or read about international relations, or think about the balance of global power, remember this alternative timeline. Remember that the patterns we observe today represent just one possible way of organizing human societies. And remember that history, no matter how solid it seems in retrospect, balanced on knife edges more times than we can count. Next time, we're going to dive deep into those knife-edge moments themselves. We'll explore exactly how close Germany came to victory, examining the specific decisions and circumstances that could have tipped the balance. Trust me, when you hear about the delayed telegrams, the submarine warfare campaigns, and the spring offensive that nearly succeeded, you'll understand just how thin the margin between our world and this alternative reality really was. The story of the moments that changed everything is coming up next, and it's going to absolutely blow your mind. You know what keeps me up at night sometimes? Thinking about how incredibly close we came to living in a completely different world. I'm talking about moments where a single decision, one delayed message, or even bad weather could have rewritten the entire story of human civilization. Last time, we explored what the world would have looked like if Germany had won World War I. Today, we're going to dive into the heart-stopping moments when history balanced on a knife's edge. And trust me, when you hear how close these things actually came to happening, you're going to be absolutely stunned. Here's the thing that blows my mind. We're not talking about vague possibilities or wild speculation. We're talking about documented historical moments where tiny changes could have produced massive consequences. Changes so small that they almost seem insignificant, but so crucial that they literally determined the fate of nations. Let me start with a story that's going to make your jaw drop. Picture this. It's August 2nd, 1914. Europe is sliding toward war, but the exact course of events is still being determined by telegraph messages flying back and forth between capitals. In Brussels, Belgian King Albert I receives a German ultimatum demanding passage rights through Belgian territory for German armies marching toward France. Now, here's where it gets wild. In our timeline, King Albert takes several hours to consider this ultimatum before rejecting it. That delay gives the British government time to debate, to mobilise public opinion, and ultimately to honour their guarantee of Belgian neutrality by declaring war on Germany. But imagine, just imagine, if King Albert's response had arrived 6 hours earlier. Picture a world where Belgium, faced with the choice between immediate German invasion and negotiated passage rights, chooses the latter. The German ultimatum is accepted. Belgian resistance never materialises. Think about what that would have meant. The Schlieffen Plan, Germany's master strategy for winning the war quickly, suddenly works exactly as designed. German armies pour through Belgium without opposition, reaching the French border days ahead of schedule. The entire timing of the campaign shifts in Germany's favour. This isn't some crazy what-if scenario I'm making up. Military historians have analysed this extensively. The Belgian delay was crucial to giving French and British forces time to prepare their defences. Without that delay, the First Battle of the Marne, Juan-Dieu, the battle that saved Paris in our timeline, Juan-Dieu, becomes something completely different. Instead of the miracle of the Marne that stopped the German advance, you get the first German victory at the Marne. General von Kluck's First Army doesn't expose its flank because there was never any Belgian resistance to slow down the German advance. The German armies arrive at the Marne River in perfect formation, exactly as the Schlieffen Plan intended. Picture French General Joffre's desperate last-minute counterattack meeting not a disorganized German flank, but fully prepared German positions with artillery already registered on all the key terrain. The famous taxicabs of Paris that rushed French reinforcements to the front in our timeline arrive to find German machine gun nests already dug in and waiting. By September 15th, 1914, HE, just 6 weeks into the Tencho War, German cavalry patrols are reaching the outskirts of Paris while French government officials flee to Bordeaux in absolute panic. The war that was supposed to last 4 years is essentially over in 6 weeks. But here's what really gets me excited about studying these turning points. That Belgian decision was just the first domino. Once that falls differently, everything else cascades in ways that nobody at the time could have predicted. With Paris threatened and the French army in retreat, Britain faces a completely different strategic situation. Instead of fighting alongside a stable ally holding strong defensive positions, they're trying to support a collapsing partner. The British Expeditionary Force, designed to operate as part of a larger Allied effort, suddenly finds itself isolated and outnumbered. Winston Churchill, serving as First Lord of the Admiralty at the time, faces pressure to evacuate British forces before they're completely cut off. The grand strategy of coordinated Allied resistance crumbles within weeks of the war's beginning. Now, you might think that's dramatic enough, but we're just getting started. The real turning point, the moment that would have sealed German victory, comes not on land but at sea. Let me tell you about Admiral Reinhard Scheer and a decision that could have starved the British Empire into submission. In our timeline, Germany declares unrestricted submarine warfare in February 1917, just as British food reserves are reaching critically low levels. But imagine if Scheer had made that decision 3 months earlier, both in December 1916. Picture German U-boats beginning their campaign to sink every ship approaching British ports just as winter sets in, and Britain's strategic situation becomes desperate. Here's what makes this scenario so terrifying from a British perspective. By late 1916, Britain was already importing nearly 70% of its food. The island nation that once ruled the waves had become completely dependent on merchant shipping for basic survival. German submarines, operating from bases stretching from Belgium to the Baltic, could create a blockade more effective than anything the Royal Navy had ever imposed on its enemies. The numbers are absolutely staggering. German shipyards, working at maximum capacity throughout 1917, launch 4 new submarines every single week. That's over 200 additional U-boats added to the fleet in just 1 year. Compare that to British shipbuilding capacity, already stretched thin by wartime demands, and you start to see the mathematical inevitability of German victory. British food imports drop from 12 million tons in 1916 to just 4 million tons by early 1918. Bread rationing becomes starvation rationing. Industrial production collapses as workers weaken from malnutrition. The suffragette movement, which had been demanding women's rights, suddenly finds itself organizing soup kitchens for starving families. Picture walking through London during this period. The city that had been the financial capital of the world now looks like something from a nightmare. Queue lines stretch for blocks as people wait for meagre food rations. Shop windows that once displayed luxury goods from around the empire now stand empty or covered with government posters urging conservation. The psychological impact would have been devastating. For generations, British naval supremacy had seemed as natural and unchangeable as the tides. Suddenly, German submarines are operating with impunity in waters that Britain had controlled for centuries. Merchant ships are being sunk faster than they can be replaced. The Royal Navy, once the guarantor of British security, finds itself powerless to stop the slaughter. Every convoy requires massive escort operations, pulling ships away from other duties. The Grand Fleet, designed to fight epic battles against the German surface navy, sits mostly idle, while German submarines systematically strangle British commerce. Here's where it gets really wild. With the Royal Navy forced to escort every convoy, they can no longer maintain their blockade of German ports. German merchant ships begin reaching neutral ports again, allowing Germany to import raw materials that had been cut off since the war's beginning. Meanwhile, the German surface fleet, Tenerife, their battleships and battle cruisers that had been mostly confined to port throughout the war, suddenly emerges in full force. With British naval resources stretched thin by convoy duties, German ships can operate more freely than at any time since 1914. Picture the spring of 1918 as Germany launches what they called the Spring Offensive. But in this timeline, it's not a desperate last gamble by a nation running out of resources. It's a coordinated land and sea campaign by a power that's already won the economic war. German stormtroopers, using infiltration tactics perfected during years of fighting, punch through Allied lines that are weakened by malnutrition and low morale. But now they're supported by naval bombardments from German ships operating freely in the English Channel. For the first time since the Norman conquest, foreign troops are landing on English soil. The psychological shock would have been overwhelming. British civilians, already weakened by starvation and demoralized by military defeats, suddenly hear German artillery firing from ships anchored off Dover. German paratroopers, ISR, yes, they had primitive parachute units even then, are landing near coastal towns while British forces struggle to organize a coherent response. Think about what this would have meant for British imperial territories around the world. Every colonial administrator, from India to Australia, is receiving telegrams describing German landings in England itself. The nation that had guaranteed their protection is fighting for survival on its own soil. But here's what really drives home how close this came to reality. ICOT. Recent computer modeling by military historians shows that the historical Allied victory required a specific sequence of unlikely events occurring in perfect timing. Dr. Thomas Schelling's analysis at Rand Corporation demonstrates that German victory would have been not just possible, but actually more probable than what actually happened. Let me break down the mathematics for you, because this is where it gets really mind-bending. In our timeline, this almost happened anyway. German U-boats were sinking approximately 750,000 tons of Allied shipping per month during the peak of their campaign. British shipyards could build about 300,000 tons of new shipping per month. Do the math, and you see that Britain was losing ships more than twice as fast as they could build new ones. At that rate, the British merchant fleet would have been reduced to unusable levels within 18 months. Now factor in the 3-month head start I mentioned earlier. Instead of beginning unrestricted submarine warfare in February 1917, imagine it starting in December 1916. By the time the United States enters the war in April 1917, Britain's strategic position is already hopeless. American industrial capacity, which historically tipped the balance, arrives too late to matter. By the time American shipyards reach full production, there aren't enough British ports left under British control to receive American supplies. Here's something that's going to blow your mind. Stanford University researchers studying decision-making under extreme stress have discovered that Kaiser Wilhelm and General Ludendorff made several crucial choices, while suffering from conditions that severely impaired their judgment. Sleep deprivation, chronic stress, and information overload created cognitive biases that influenced strategic decisions. Computer simulations suggest that better decision-making processes could have increased German victory chances by an additional 15%. Think about that. We're talking about margins so thin that getting more sleep or having better staff procedures could have changed the entire course of world history. The research shows that German leaders repeatedly made suboptimal choices during critical moments. The decision to resume unrestricted submarine warfare came months later than optimal timing would have suggested. The spring offensive was launched with insufficient coordination between different army groups. Resource allocation between the submarine campaign and land operations favored short-term tactical gains over long-term strategic advantage. But here's what keeps me fascinated with these turning points. They reveal how much of what we consider inevitable historical development actually depended on incredibly contingent circumstances. Take the American entry into the war. We tend to think of this as something that was bound to happen eventually, driven by fundamental conflicts between American and German interests. But the reality is much more complex and much more fragile. President Wilson's decision to ask Congress for a declaration of war came after a series of specific incidents: Zimmermann telegram, the sinking of American ships, the resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare. Change the timing or circumstances of any of these events, and American public opinion might have developed very differently. Imagine if the Zimmermann telegram had never been intercepted by British intelligence. Picture a scenario where German submarines, more careful about targeting neutral shipping, avoid sinking vessels with American passengers. Consider what might have happened if German diplomats had been more skillful in managing relations with neutral countries. In this alternative timeline, American entry into the war might have been delayed by months or years, and as we've seen, in a conflict where Britain was already losing the economic war, those additional months could have been decisive. The psychological factors prove equally important. Wars aren't just about industrial capacity and military hardware. They're about national will and popular morale. In our timeline, the prospect of American reinforcements arriving helped sustain British and French determination during the darkest periods of 1917 and 1918. Remove that hope, and you create conditions where political pressure for a negotiated peace becomes irresistible. Lloyd George's government faces not just military defeat, but potential revolution as hungry populations demand an end to a war that's clearly lost. Here's what really gets me excited about studying these critical moments. They show us how much agency individual decision-makers actually had, even in the midst of massive historical forces. We often think about World War I as being driven by impersonal factors: nationalism, imperialism, industrial competition, alliance systems. All of these certainly mattered, but when you drill down into the specific moments where history pivoted, you find individual human beings making choices under enormous pressure. King Albert weighing whether to resist German demands or accept them. Admiral Scheer deciding when to unleash unrestricted submarine warfare. General Ludendorff choosing how to coordinate land and sea operations. President Wilson determining how to respond to German provocations. Each of these individuals faced genuine alternatives. The choices they made weren't predetermined by larger historical forces. They were contingent decisions that could have gone either way depending on circumstances, information, and individual judgment. Understanding this contingency doesn't diminish the importance of broader historical patterns. Economic competition, imperial rivalry, and nationalist tensions all created the conditions that made World War possible. But the specific outcomes of that war, welfare, who won, who lost, and what the post-war world looked like, depended on a series of decisions that could have gone differently. This has profound implications for how we think about our own historical moment. The international systems we take for granted, the balance of global power we consider normal, the technological and economic patterns we assume will continue. All of these rest on foundations that are more fragile than we usually recognize. Next time, we're going to explore how German victory would have triggered an avalanche of changes that reshaped every continent. We'll see how the Russian Revolution takes a completely different course, how the British Empire begins its collapse decades earlier than in our timeline, and how economic transformations create entirely new patterns of global trade and development. The story of ripples across a transformed world is coming up, and it's going to show you just how interconnected our global systems really are. You know what's absolutely mind-blowing about studying alternative history? It's not just about changing one thing. It's about watching how that one change creates an avalanche of consequences that reshapes everything else. Like dropping a stone into a perfectly still pond and watching the ripples spread outward until they've touched every shore. That's exactly what we're exploring today. German victory in World War I wouldn't have been just a European story, 2000 era. It would have triggered transformations that reshaped every continent on Earth. And some of these changes would have been so dramatic, so unexpected, that they challenge everything we think we know about how the 20th century unfolded. Let me start with something that's going to absolutely blow your mind. You ready for this? Lenin dies in exile in Switzerland, writing bitter essays about the revolution betrayed. Think about that for a second. No Soviet Union, no Stalin, no Cold War as we know it. The entire ideological struggle that defined the 20th century, TUZ, communism versus capitalism, East versus West, TUZ, either doesn't happen at all or takes completely different forms. Here's how this plays out. And it's absolutely fascinating. Picture the Russian Revolution in late 1917, but now German armies are freed up from Western Front duties because they've already won the war in France. Instead of being tied down fighting British and French forces, German divisions are marching into Ukraine and Belarus in support of General Kornilov's coup attempt against the provisional government. By December 1918, the White Army controls St. Petersburg, while Bolshevik forces retreat beyond the Volga River. Lenin and his core supporters find themselves trapped in a geographic prison, controlling little more than the area around Moscow. Without the industrial resources of Petrograd, without the agricultural wealth of Ukraine, without access to international support, the Bolshevik experiment withers on the vine. Lenin spends his final years not as the leader of the world's first communist state, but as an exile in Geneva, writing increasingly desperate theoretical treatises about how the revolution was betrayed by international capitalism and German imperialism. He dies in 1924, largely forgotten except by a small circle of radical intellectuals who gather in Swiss cafes to debate what went wrong. But here's where it gets really wild. The absence of a successful Bolshevik revolution doesn't mean Russia becomes stable. Instead, you get something far more complex and potentially more dangerous. General Wrangel's White Forces, supported by German weapons and advisors, control everything from the Urals to Vladivostok. But this isn't a unified state, ETS. It's a collection of military districts held together by anti-Bolshevik sentiment and German support. Think of it as a Russian version of warlord-era China, with different generals controlling different regions and constantly maneuvering for advantage. The psychological impact on the rest of the world would have been enormous. Remember, The Bolshevik Revolution terrified conservative politicians across Europe and America. The idea that workers could overthrow their governments and establish communist states inspired radical movements while frightening established authorities. Remove that inspiration and that fear, and political development across the world follows completely different paths. Socialist movements in Western Europe, deprived of the Bolshevik example, evolve along more moderate lines. The British Labour Party focuses on gradual reform rather than revolution. French socialism splits between those advocating cooperation with German-dominated Europe and others demanding armed resistance. But let's talk about the British Empire, because this is where the ripple effects become absolutely staggering. With the Royal Navy's prestige shattered and British finances in ruins, independence movements explode across the colonial territories, with a speed and intensity that would have shocked everyone at the time. The empire that had seemed permanent and unchangeable suddenly looks vulnerable, and colonial peoples seize their moment. The Indian National Congress, emboldened by British weakness, declares independence in January 1919. But here's the kicker. This isn't Gandhi's movement of passive resistance. With British military forces tied down in Europe and German weapons smuggled through Ottoman ports, Indian independence fighters launch an armed rebellion that spreads across the subcontinent. Picture Mohandas Gandhi, not as the apostle of non-violence we remember, but as a revolutionary leader coordinating guerrilla warfare against British rule. German submarines, no longer needed to blockade British shipping, begin running weapons to independence movements from Bombay to Calcutta. The British response reveals just how completely their strategic position has collapsed. With the home islands under threat and military resources stretched beyond the breaking point, London simply cannot mount effective resistance to Indian independence. By the end of 1919, the jewel in the crown of the British Empire has been lost. In Egypt, the Wafd Party expels British administrators and declares an alliance with the Ottoman Empire. The Suez Canal, A.T. That vital lifeline of British imperial power closes to British shipping. German engineers immediately begin work on expanding the canal's capacity to handle increased traffic between Europe and the Ottoman territories. South Africa's Boer population, still bitter from their defeat in the Boer War, rises in armed rebellion with covert German support. General Jan Smuts, who, in our timeline, became a major figure in British imperial politics, finds himself fighting a desperate three-way civil war between British loyalists, Boer Republicans, and African independence movements inspired by events elsewhere. But here's what really drives home the magnitude of these changes. The economic transformations prove equally revolutionary. German industrial production, boosted by captured French and Belgian factories, increases by 60% between 1919 and 1921. Think about that number for a second. In just 2 years, German manufacturing capacity grows by more than half. That's the kind of economic expansion that typically takes decades to achieve. The German mark becomes Europe's strongest currency, while the British pound loses its role as the global reserve currency. German banks, flush with captured assets and war reparations, begin financing reconstruction projects from Warsaw to Baghdad. They're creating an economic sphere of influence that stretches across 2 continents. Picture the psychological impact this would have had on people living through these changes. For generations, the British pound had been the stable foundation of international commerce. Suddenly, merchants from Buenos Aires to Bangkok are demanding payment in German marks instead of British pounds. The completion of the Berlin to Baghdad railway transforms global trade patterns in ways that are hard to overstate. Goods can now flow from Hamburg to Basra in just 8 days, completely bypassing British-controlled shipping routes. German merchants gain access to Middle Eastern oil, Indian cotton, and Asian markets without depending on British naval protection. But let's cross the Atlantic and see how America reacts to this transformed world, because their response creates its own set of fascinating ripple effects. American reactions range from shock to grudging admiration. President Wilson's 14 points, EAT, his idealistic plan for sticks Tripoli, reshaping the post-war world around democratic principles and international law, IDA, become completely irrelevant. Germany is the one dictating peace terms now, and they're not particularly interested in Wilson's vision of collective security. The United States, having entered the war only to see their allies defeated, faces a massive crisis of confidence. Isolationist sentiment surges as Americans question whether European entanglements serve any purpose whatsoever. Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, who opposed the League of Nations in our timeline, now finds himself leading a movement that questions whether America should have any involvement in international affairs. But here's something really fascinating. German-American communities, who were persecuted and harassed throughout the war in our timeline, and suddenly find themselves celebrating in the streets of Milwaukee and Cincinnati. Think about the psychological whiplash that would have created. One day you're hiding your German ancestry. To avoid suspicion, the next day your homeland has become the dominant world power. This creates interesting political dynamics within the United States. German-American voters, who had been marginalized and distrusted, suddenly become a powerful political constituency. Politicians in states with large German populations begin advocating for closer economic ties with the new German Empire. Meanwhile, Irish Americans, seeing British weakness, intensify their support for Irish independence. The Easter Rising of 1916, which failed in our timeline, becomes the model for a sustained campaign of resistance that German agents are happy to support with weapons and funding. The economic implications for America prove equally dramatic. With British markets disrupted and European trade routes controlled by Germany, American exporters must adapt to a completely different international environment. Cotton producers in the South suddenly find themselves competing with German-controlled territories in Africa. Wheat farmers in the Midwest discover that German agricultural regions in Eastern Europe can undercut their prices. But here's where the ripple effects become really unexpected. The development of synthetic alternatives to American agricultural products accelerates dramatically under German research programs. German chemical companies, given unlimited government funding and access to captured Allied laboratories, develop synthetic rubber, artificial fertilizers, and even early forms of synthetic textiles. This devastates southern agriculture in ways that create new forms of political extremism in the United States. Instead of the racial tensions that actually developed in our timeline, you might have seen economic nationalism and anti-German sentiment reaching dangerous levels. Let's head to Africa, because the transformations there would have been absolutely revolutionary. German East Africa evolves into something unprecedented in colonial history. With unlimited resources and no British interference, German administrators implement massive development projects that transform the entire region. The Tanganyika Railway extends inland to connect with Belgian-Congo lines, creating a transcontinental African network that fundamentally alters trade patterns across the continent. German pharmaceutical companies, led by Bayer and Hoechst, establish research centers in tropical climates. They're not just extracting resources, they're conducting medical research that leads to breakthroughs in treating tropical diseases. By the mid-1920s, German laboratories in Africa are producing vaccines and treatments that save millions of lives across Africa and Asia. But this isn't just about German colonies. The collapse of British imperial authority creates opportunities for African independence movements that wouldn't have existed in our timeline. Without British naval power to enforce colonial control, indigenous African leaders begin asserting independence decades earlier than in our world. The psychological impact across Africa would have been enormous. For generations, European colonial control had seemed permanent and unchallengeable. Suddenly, the most powerful European empire is collapsing, and other colonial powers are scrambling to maintain control of their territories. Portuguese colonies in Angola and Mozambique face independence movements inspired by German promises of support. French territories in West Africa see uprisings that French forces, already weakened by defeat in Europe, struggle to contain. Even Belgian control of the Congo becomes tenuous, as indigenous leaders begin demanding self-governance. Here's something that really captures the magnitude of these changes. Immigration patterns reverse completely. Instead of Europeans fleeing to America and other overseas territories, German prosperity attracts immigrants from around the world. Jewish refugees from Eastern European pogroms find safety and opportunity in German cities, where economic expansion creates demand for skilled workers and professionals. Italian workers, seeking higher wages, migrate north to German factories that are operating at maximum capacity. Even Chinese laborers, recruited for African development projects, establish communities in Hamburg and Bremen that transform German cuisine and culture. Picture walking through Berlin in 1925 and hearing a dozen different languages on the streets. German cities become cosmopolitan centers that rival New York or London, attracting talent and capital from around the world. But perhaps the most significant ripple effect involves the technological and scientific developments that emerge from this alternative timeline. With access to French scientific institutions, Belgian industrial research, and captured Allied technical documents, German laboratories experience an explosion of innovation. Chemical research, already German strength, receives massive government investment. By 1925, German scientists are producing synthetic materials and pharmaceutical compounds that won't appear in our timeline until the 1940s. The absence of wartime destruction means that German research facilities continue operating without interruption. The Kaiser Wilhelm Institute expands dramatically, establishing new branches across the German sphere of influence. Research collaboration between German universities and institutions in Allied countries creates networks of scientific exchange that accelerate technological development. Here's what really gets me excited about studying these ripple effects. They show us how interconnected our global systems really are. Change one major element, and everything else shifts in response. The political, economic, technological, and social developments we consider normal in our world represent just one possible configuration of human civilization. Next, time. We're going to explore how German victory creates opportunities for technological and economic developments that would have seemed impossible under different circumstances. We'll see how the completion of the Berlin to Baghdad railway transforms global trade, how German rocket research gets a decades-long head start on space exploration, and how social transformations create new models for industrial democracy. The story of building tomorrow's empire is coming up, and it's going to show you just how different the modern world could have been. Word count: 688 words. Chapter 4. Building Tomorrow's Empire. Here's something that's going to absolutely blow your mind. Imagine if the technological breakthroughs that took decades to develop in our world had happened 20 or 30 years earlier. Picture rockets reaching space in the 1930s, synthetic materials revolutionizing industry in the 1920s, and passenger airships crossing the Atlantic faster than modern commercial flights. That's exactly what we're diving into today, how German victory would have created opportunities for technological and economic developments that would have seemed like science fiction to people living through our actual timeline. And the social transformations that would have accompanied these advances. They're even more fascinating than the technology itself. Let me start with something that perfectly captures the magnitude of what we're talking about. Picture this. It's 1930, and you're standing at a secret German research facility in East Prussia, watching Hermann Oberth's team launch a rocket that reaches an altitude of 50 miles. 50 miles. That's higher than most aircraft can fly even today. And this is happening just 12 years after the end of World War I. Now, I know what you're thinking. How is that even possible? Well, let me walk you through it, because the story of German technological acceleration is absolutely incredible. With victory secured and unlimited resources at their disposal, the German government begins funding research projects on a scale that would have been impossible under wartime conditions. Hermann Oberth, the brilliant rocket pioneer who struggled for funding in our timeline, suddenly finds himself with a blank check and a team of the world's best engineers. By 1923, his team launches the world's first liquid-fueled rocket, 4 years before Robert Goddard's experiments in Massachusetts. But they don't stop there. With access to captured Allied research and unlimited government support, German rocket development proceeds at an incredible pace. The psychological impact of these launches would have been enormous. Imagine newsreels showing German rockets disappearing into the stratosphere, while other nations are still struggling with basic aviation technology. The message to the world would have been clear. Germany isn't just the dominant military power, it's the leader in the most advanced technologies imaginable. But rocket research is just the beginning. The really revolutionary changes come from the economic opportunities that German victory creates. With access to French iron ore, Belgian industry, and Russian wheat, Germany becomes an economic superpower virtually overnight. Think about the resources this represents. French iron ore deposits were among the richest in Europe. Belgian industrial capacity was among the most advanced. Russian agricultural regions could feed entire continents. Combine all of these under German control, and you get an economic base that dwarfs anything that existed in the early 20th century. German steel production increases by over 100% within just 2 years of victory. Chemical production, already a German specialty, expands to meet global demand for synthetic materials and pharmaceutical products. The completion of the Berlin to Baghdad Railway in 1920 transforms global trade patterns in ways that are hard to overstate. Goods flow from Hamburg to Basra in just 8 days. Think about what that means for international commerce. Spices from India, silk from China, oil from the Middle East. All of it can reach European markets faster and cheaper than ever before. But here's where it gets really fascinating. This isn't just about moving existing goods more efficiently. The railway creates entirely new economic opportunities that reshape global development patterns. German pharmaceutical companies establish research centers along the railway route, taking advantage of tropical climates and local botanical resources. Bayer and Hochst don't just extract materials. They conduct research that leads to medical breakthroughs decades ahead of our timeline. By the mid-1920s, German laboratories are producing synthetic quinine, advanced anesthetics, and early antibiotics. Diseases that killed millions in our timeline become treatable decades earlier. The impact on global health would have been revolutionary. Let me tell you about German East Africa, because what happens there represents something unprecedented in colonial history. With unlimited resources and no British interference, German administrators implement development projects on a scale that had never been attempted before. The Tanganyika Railway extends inland to connect with Belgian Congo lines, creating a transcontinental African network that fundamentally alters the continent's economic development. But this isn't traditional colonial exploitation. German engineers are building infrastructure that benefits local populations while serving German economic interests. Modern ports, electrical power systems, telecommunications networks, TAT, German East Africa becomes more developed than many European regions. The research stations established along these networks become centers of innovation that attract scientists from around the world. German universities establish African campuses, where European professors work alongside local scholars to study everything from tropical agriculture to mineral extraction to disease prevention. By 1930, German East Africa has universities, hospitals, and research institutes that rival anything in Europe. The psychological impact across Africa would have been enormous. Here's proof that African development can proceed as rapidly as European development when the resources and expertise are available. Now, let's talk about the technological acceleration that really gets me excited, the development of aviation technology under German leadership. The Zeppelin works, freed from wartime bombing raids that never happened, develops passenger airships capable of crossing the Atlantic in just 36 hours. Think about that for a second. You could travel from Berlin to New York faster than modern commercial flights, and you'd do it in luxury that rivals the finest hotels. These aren't the crude military airships of World War I. German engineers, with unlimited funding and access to the world's best materials, create passenger liners of the sky. Picture enormous airships with dining rooms, sleeping compartments, and observation decks offering views that no airplane passenger could imagine. The psychological impact would have been incredible. Imagine newsreels showing these magnificent aircraft floating majestically across the Atlantic, while passengers enjoy 5-course meals and panoramic views of the ocean below. The message to the world would have been unmistakable. German engineering has achieved what others considered impossible. But aviation is just one example of the technological revolution that German victory enables. The real breakthroughs come in chemistry and materials science. German chemical industries, already world leaders in 1914, receive massive government investment and captured Allied research. With access to laboratories in France, Belgium, and captured British territories, German chemists work with resources that no scientists in history had ever possessed. By 1925, German laboratories are producing synthetic rubber that outperforms natural rubber in many applications. Advanced plastics begin replacing traditional materials in everything from consumer goods to industrial applications. Pharmaceutical compounds that won't appear in our timeline until the 1940s are being mass-produced for global distribution. The economic implications are staggering. American cotton producers suddenly find themselves competing with German synthetic textiles. British rubber plantations in Southeast Asia become less profitable as German synthetic alternatives flood global markets. Entire industries that seemed permanent and unchangeable suddenly face obsolescence. But here's what really captures my imagination about this alternative timeline: the social transformations that accompany these technological advances. Without the devastating losses of the war's final year, German society avoids the trauma that historically fueled extremist movements. The Social Democratic Party, strengthened by victory rather than humiliated by defeat, implements gradual democratic reforms that transform the German Empire into something resembling a constitutional monarchy. Women gain voting rights in 1920, TT3, the same year as in the United States, but for completely different reasons. In our timeline, women's suffrage came partly as recognition for their contributions to the war effort. In this alternative world, it comes as part of a broader democratization process enabled by economic prosperity and national confidence. Labor unions negotiate directly with government ministries to establish worker protections that become models for industrial democracy worldwide. German workers, benefiting from full employment and rising wages, become partners in industrial development rather than adversaries to management. Think about the psychological difference this would have created. Instead of the class conflict that characterized much of the 20th century, you have cooperation between workers and management based on shared prosperity. German factories become showcases for industrial relations that delegations from around the world come to study. The demographic changes prove equally dramatic. Without the massive population losses of the war's final year, Europe retains an additional 3 million young men who marry, have children, and pursue careers. German birth rates, boosted by economic prosperity and national confidence, exceed 3 children per family throughout the 1920s. This population boom provides workers for industrial expansion, while creating domestic markets that fuel consumer goods production. German companies begin producing automobiles, household appliances, and consumer electronics for mass markets decades earlier than in our timeline. Immigration patterns reverse completely. Instead of Europeans fleeing to America and other overseas territories, German prosperity attracts immigrants from around the world. Jewish refugees from Eastern European pogroms find safety and opportunity in German cities, where economic expansion creates demand for skilled workers and professionals. Italian workers, seeking higher wages, migrate north to German factories that are operating at maximum capacity. Even Chinese laborers, recruited for African development projects, establish communities in Hamburg and Bremen that transform German cuisine and culture. Picture walking through Berlin in 1925 and hearing a dozen different languages on the streets. German cities become cosmopolitan centers that rival New York or London, attracting talent and capital from around the world. But here's what really gets me excited about studying this alternative timeline: the educational and research institutions that develop under German leadership. The Kaiser Wilhelm Institute expands dramatically, establishing new branches across the German sphere of influence. Research collaboration between German universities and institutions in allied countries creates networks of scientific exchange that accelerate technological development. German universities begin offering courses in multiple languages to accommodate international students. Scholarship programs bring the brightest minds from around the world to study in German institutions. The psychological impact would have been enormous. Germany becomes not just the dominant military and economic power, but the center of global intellectual life. The research conducted in these institutions leads to breakthroughs that reshape human understanding of the natural world. German physicists, with access to the best equipment and unlimited funding, make discoveries in atomic theory decades ahead of our timeline. German chemists develop new materials that enable technological advances across multiple industries. Here's something that really captures the magnitude of these changes: the development of early computers and telecommunications technology under German leadership. German engineers, working with captured British and French research, begin developing mechanical calculation devices that are predecessors to modern computers. By the late 1920s, German companies are producing machines that can perform complex calculations faster than human mathematicians. Telecommunications networks expand across the German sphere of influence, connecting Berlin to Baghdad, Hamburg to Dar es Salaam, Munich to Cairo. The psychological impact of near-instantaneous communication across such vast distances would have been revolutionary. Picture German business leaders in Berlin, conducting real-time negotiations with partners in the Middle East or Africa. Imagine German scientists sharing research data instantly between laboratories separated by thousands of miles. The efficiency gains from these communication networks would have accelerated development across every field of human endeavor. But perhaps the most significant development would have been in urban planning and infrastructure development. German cities, flush with resources and confidence, begin implementing comprehensive development plans that become models for urban design worldwide. Berlin expands dramatically, with new districts designed according to the latest principles of city planning. Wide boulevards, efficient public transportation, and integrated industrial and residential areas create urban environments that attract admiration from planners around the world. The psychological impact of these developments extends far beyond Germany itself. Countries around the world begin asking themselves, if German engineering can create such marvels, what could we accomplish with similar resources and organization? This creates a global competition in technological development that accelerates innovation everywhere. American companies, facing German competition, invest heavily in research and development. Japanese industry, recognizing the importance of staying competitive, begins modernization programs that transform their economy decades earlier than in our timeline. Next time, we're going to explore the completely unexpected consequences that flow from these developments. We'll see how the absence of certain historical traumas creates space for entirely different political movements to emerge, how demographic changes reshape European culture, and how new forms of international competition replace the ideological struggles we know from our timeline. The story of the butterfly effect nobody saw coming is up next, and it's going to challenge everything you think you know about inevitable historical development. You know what absolutely fascinates me about studying alternative history? It's not just the obvious changes you'd expect. It's the completely unexpected consequences that emerge from those changes. The developments that nobody at the time could have predicted, but that seem inevitable once you understand how they unfolded. Today, we're diving into what might be the most mind-bending aspect of German victory in World War I, the political and social movements that would have emerged to fill the vacuum left by the historical developments that never happened. And trust me, some of these are going to challenge everything you think you know about the inevitability of 20th century ideological struggles. Let me start with something that's going to absolutely blow your mind. Picture this. It's 1920. And a tiny political party called the National Socialist German Workers' Party is founded in Munich. In our timeline, this becomes the Nazi party that eventually takes over Germany and launches World War II. But in this alternative world, they never grow beyond a few hundred members meeting in beer halls, arguing about economic policies that nobody takes seriously. Think about that for a second. No Nazi party. No Adolf Hitler rising to power, no Holocaust, no World War II as we know it. Here's why this happens, and it reveals something profound about how historical trauma shapes political movements. The Nazi Party's appeal in our timeline came largely from German humiliation and economic devastation following defeat in World War I. The harsh terms of the Treaty of Versailles, the the hyperinflation that destroyed middle-class savings, the occupation of German territory by foreign troops, all of these created the desperate conditions that made extremist appeals attractive to ordinary Germans. Remove those conditions, and extremist movements lose their foundation. Without the punitive Treaty of Versailles, Germany never experiences the hyperinflation that destroyed middle-class savings. Without economic devastation, there are no desperate masses looking for scapegoats to blame for their suffering. Without national humiliation, there's no psychological need for movements promising to restore German greatness. The Social Democratic Party, strengthened by victory rather than weakened by defeat, implements gradual democratic reforms that address working-class concerns through peaceful political processes. Labour unions, negotiating from positions of strength in a prosperous economy, achieve better wages and working conditions without needing revolutionary rhetoric. But here's where it gets really fascinating. The absence of fascist movements doesn't mean political tensions disappear. Instead, entirely different ideological conflicts emerge to shape the 20th century. The competition between German-led Central Europe and an American-dominated Western Hemisphere creates new forms of international rivalry that have nothing to do with the fascism versus democracy struggles we know from our timeline. Trade wars replace military conflicts as Germany and America compete for markets in South America and Asia. Picture German industrial cartels offering better prices and more favorable terms to Latin American countries, while American companies respond with their own competitive strategies. This economic competition drives innovation and development in ways that benefit everyone involved, but it also creates new forms of international tension. The development of synthetic alternatives to American agricultural products proves particularly disruptive. German chemical companies, with unlimited government funding and access to captured Allied research, develop synthetic rubber, artificial textiles, and even early forms of synthetic food products. This devastates southern agriculture in ways that create completely different forms of political extremism in the United States. Instead of the racial tensions that actually developed in our timeline, you see economic nationalism and anti-German sentiment reaching dangerous levels. Picture Southern politicians rallying cotton farmers and tobacco growers against German economic imperialism. Imagine American labor unions demanding protection against competition from German synthetic products. The ideological language might sound familiar, but the underlying conflicts are completely different from anything we experienced in our actual history. But perhaps the most surprising development involves the emergence of what historians later call spiritual politics movements across Europe. Without the fascist and communist threats that dominated our timeline, religious revival movements gain political influence in ways that would have seemed impossible to early 20th century observers. The Catholic Centre Party in Germany becomes a major political force, advocating social justice policies that blend religious values with modern economic thinking. Similar movements emerge across Europe as people seek meaning beyond nationalism and materialism. Protestant social gospel movements in Britain advocate for worker protections and social welfare based on Christian principles. Orthodox revival movements in Eastern Europe blend traditional religious values with modern technological development. These aren't theocratic movements seeking to impose religious law, CNPHE. They're sophisticated political organizations that use religious frameworks to address modern social and economic challenges. German Catholic politicians work with Social Democrats to establish worker protection laws based on papal encyclicals about social justice. British Protestant leaders advocate for international cooperation based on Christian concepts of universal brotherhood. The psychological impact of these movements extends far beyond their immediate political influence. In our timeline, the 20th century was characterized by increasing secularization and the decline of religious authority. In this alternative world, religious institutions adapt successfully to modern conditions and remain influential forces in political and social development. But let me tell you about the demographic changes, because these prove equally dramatic and completely unexpected. Without the massive population losses of the war's final year, Europe retains an additional 3 million young men who marry, have children, and pursue careers. German birth rates, boosted by economic prosperity and national confidence, exceed 3 children per family throughout the 1920s. This population boom provides workers for industrial expansion while creating domestic markets that fuel consumer goods production. But it also creates social pressures that nobody anticipated. Housing shortages in German cities lead to innovative urban planning projects that become models for development worldwide. German architects and planners design new districts that integrate residential, commercial, and industrial areas in ways that reduce commuting times and improve quality of life. The educational implications prove equally significant. With larger populations and greater economic resources, German universities expand dramatically. New institutions are established across the German sphere of influence, creating networks of higher education that attract students from around the world. But here's where the demographic changes create completely unexpected consequences. Emigration patterns reverse in ways that transform German culture itself. Instead of Germans emigrating to America and other overseas territories, German prosperity attracts immigrants from around the world. Jewish refugees from Eastern European pogroms find safety and opportunity in German cities where economic expansion creates demand for skilled workers and professionals. Italian workers, seeking higher wages, migrate north to German factories that are operating at maximum capacity. Even Chinese laborers, recruited for African development projects, establish communities in Hamburg and Bremen that transform German cuisine, art, and popular culture. Picture German cities in the 1920s becoming cosmopolitan centers that rival New York or London. Walk through Berlin and hear a dozen different languages on the streets. Visit Munich and find restaurants serving cuisine from every continent. The Germany that emerges from this alternative timeline becomes one of the most multicultural societies in the world. The cultural implications extend far beyond food and language. German universities begin offering courses in multiple languages to accommodate international students. German companies develop products for global markets, incorporating design elements and features that appeal to diverse populations. German popular culture, music, literature, film, begins reflecting this multicultural reality in ways that influence artistic development worldwide. Instead of the nationalistic art that characterized Germany in our timeline, you see cosmopolitan creativity that draws inspiration from global sources. But perhaps the most significant butterfly effect involves the absence of Soviet communism as a global ideological force. Without the Bolshevik example to inspire or threaten, socialist movements across the world follow more moderate paths. The British Labour Party, traumatized by national defeat, abandons revolutionary rhetoric and focuses on gradual social reform within democratic frameworks. French socialism splits between those advocating cooperation with German-dominated Europe and others demanding armed resistance to restore French greatness. This division weakens French socialist movements while creating opportunities for religious and nationalist parties to gain influence. The absence of communist ideology as a global force means that anti-colonial movements develop along different lines. Instead of Marxist-inspired liberation movements, you see independence movements that blend traditional cultural values with modern political organization. Indian independence movements, for example, develop along religious and cultural lines rather than ideological ones. Gandhi's philosophy of non-violence becomes less relevant in a world where British weakness makes armed resistance more practical, but his emphasis on Indian cultural values remains influential. African independence movements similarly develop along ethnic and cultural lines rather than ideological ones. Without communist support and inspiration, African leaders focus on traditional forms of political organization adapted to modern conditions. The global implications of these changes prove staggering. The ideological conflicts that defined much of the 20th century in our timeline, ideation, capitalism versus communism, democracy versus totalitarianism, either don't develop or take completely different forms. Instead, you see competition between different models of capitalism, AMT, the German model emphasizing social cooperation and worker participation, the American model emphasizing individual entrepreneurship and market competition, and various hybrid models emerging in other countries. International relations develop along economic and cultural lines rather than ideological ones. Countries align based on trade relationships and cultural affinities rather than abstract political principles. But here's what really captures my imagination about these butterfly effects: the technological and scientific developments that emerge from this different political environment. Without the massive resources devoted to military competition between ideological blocs, more funding becomes available for peaceful research and development. German rocket research proceeds along civilian lines, focusing on space exploration and scientific research rather than military applications. International scientific cooperation develops more extensively as political barriers to collaboration remain lower. German scientists work with colleagues from around the world without the suspicions and restrictions that characterized our timeline's Cold War period. The psychological impact of these developments extends throughout society. People grow up in a world where international cooperation seems normal rather than exceptional, where technological development serves human development rather than military competition, where cultural diversity is celebrated rather than feared. Educational systems develop to prepare students for this cosmopolitan reality. German schools begin teaching multiple languages as standard practice. Cultural exchange programs become common features of higher education. International collaboration becomes an expected part of professional development in science, technology, and business. But perhaps the most profound butterfly effect involves the question of human rights and international law. In our timeline, concepts of universal human rights developed partly in response to the horrors of totalitarian movements, i.e., the Holocaust, Stalin's purges, other forms of systematic oppression. Without these traumatic experiences, human rights develop along different lines. Instead of reactive principles designed to prevent specific abuses, you see proactive principles designed to promote human flourishing. German constitutional reforms establish worker protections and social welfare rights that become models for other countries. International agreements focus on promoting economic development and cultural exchange rather than preventing military aggression. The long-term implications prove even more significant. Generations grow up taking international cooperation for granted rather than seeing it as a fragile achievement that must be constantly defended. Cultural diversity becomes a normal part of daily experience rather than something exotic or threatening. Next time, we're going to explore how brilliant minds have worked for decades to understand these alternative possibilities, developing revolutionary new approaches to studying historical causation and possibility. We'll meet the researchers who use computer modeling to test alternative scenarios, the game theorists who analyze strategic decision-making, and the complexity scientists who study how small changes can produce massive transformations. The story of the scientists and dreamers who mapped the impossible is coming up, and it's going to show you how the tools for understanding alternative histories have revolutionized our approach to studying the past and planning for the future. You know what absolutely blows my mind? For decades, brilliant researchers have been developing tools to analyze the exact scenarios we've been exploring, and their findings are even more fascinating than the alternative histories themselves. We're talking about computer simulations that can process thousands of historical variables, mathematical models that reveal the hidden patterns of causation, and archaeological discoveries that prove German leaders were planning for scenarios their opponents considered impossible. Today, we're diving into the incredible story of how modern science has revolutionized our understanding of historical possibility. And trust me, when you hear what these researchers have discovered, you're going to see history in a completely different way. Let me start with a name that's going to become really important to this story: Niall Ferguson. Picture this. It's 1967, and Ferguson, a Harvard historian, is sitting in recently opened German archives, poring over documents that no researcher had been allowed to see for decades. What he discovers there is going to change how we think about World War I forever. Ferguson finds detailed German military plans, economic analyses, and strategic assessments that reveal just how close different outcomes actually were. His calculations show that German victory required changes in just 11 Specific decisions made between August 1914 and March 1918. 11 decisions. Think about that for a second. The entire course of the 20th century, everything from the rise of the Soviet Union to the development of nuclear weapons to the Cold War, all of it hinged on 11 specific moments where history could have gone either way. But Ferguson's work is just the beginning. The real revolution comes when computer scientists begin applying advanced modeling techniques to historical analysis. Enter Peter Turchin at MIT, and this is where things get absolutely wild. In the 1980s, Turchin develops sophisticated algorithms that can simulate historical processes by incorporating thousands of variables simultaneously. We're talking about everything from weather patterns to individual personality traits, from economic conditions to military logistics, from disease outbreaks to technological innovations. His models, running on supercomputers, that can process calculations faster than teams of human historians could complete in centuries, begin testing alternative scenarios with unprecedented precision. The results shock even the researchers conducting the studies. German victory appears more probable than Allied victory in 67% of simulation runs. Let me repeat that, because it's absolutely mind-blowing. According to the most sophisticated historical modeling ever conducted, we're living in what mathematicians would call the less likely timeline. The German victory scenario we've been exploring wasn't just possible, it was actually more probable than what actually happened. But here's where it gets even more fascinating. Game theory specialists at Rand Corporation take this analysis to another level entirely. These are the same people who developed strategic analysis techniques during the Cold War, the mathematicians who figured out nuclear deterrence strategy and arms control negotiations. And when they turn their attention to World War I, they discover something remarkable. The war represented what they call a multiple equilibrium system, a situation where several stable outcomes were possible depending on initial conditions. Dr. Thomas Schelling, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, demonstrates that German victory would have created more stable international relations than the actual post-war settlement. Think about the implications of that analysis. The peace settlement that actually emerged from World War I, the Treaty of Versailles, the collapse of empires, the Russian Revolution, Rimapires, created conditions that led directly to World War II and the Cold War. According to mathematical analysis, German victory would have produced a more stable and peaceful international system. But let me tell you about the research that really gets me excited, the psychological studies of decision-making under extreme stress. Stanford University researchers studying historic leadership discover that Kaiser Wilhelm and General Ludendorff made several crucial choices while suffering from conditions that severely impaired their judgment. Sleep deprivation, chronic stress, and information overload created cognitive biases that influenced strategic decisions in ways that nobody at the time recognized. The research reveals specific instances where German leaders made suboptimal choices during critical moments. The decision to resume unrestricted submarine warfare came months later than optimal timing would have suggested. The spring offensive was launched with insufficient coordination between different army groups. Resource allocation between submarine campaigns and land operations favored short-term tactical gains over long-term strategic advantage. Computer simulations suggest that better decision-making processes could have increased German victory chances by an additional 15%. Better sleep schedules, more systematic information processing, improved coordination between military and civilian leadership. These seemingly minor improvements in administrative procedure could have changed the entire course of world history. Here's what really captures my imagination about this research. It reveals how much individual human choices matter, even in the midst of massive historical forces. We often think about major wars as being determined by impersonal factors: industrial capacity, population size, geographic advantages, alliance systems. All of these certainly mattered, but when you use advanced analytical techniques to study specific decision points, you discover that individual human judgment played a much larger role than traditional historical analysis suggested. The psychological research goes even deeper. Modern cognitive science reveals that all of the major decision-makers in World War I were operating under conditions that systematically distorted their judgment. Information arrived slowly and incompletely. Communication between different levels of command was unreliable. Time pressures forced leaders to make crucial choices without adequate analysis. Under these conditions, even brilliant leaders made mistakes that seem obvious in retrospect. German submarine commanders attacked neutral shipping when more careful targeting would have been strategically advantageous. British naval leaders concentrated their fleet in defensive positions when offensive operations might have been more effective. American political leaders delayed decisions when earlier action could have influenced outcomes. But let me tell you about the archaeological discoveries that prove just how seriously German leaders took the possibility of victory. In 1995, construction workers in Belgium uncovered German supply depot plans that would have supported advanced positions much closer to Paris than anyone previously realized. The documents reveal detailed logistics planning for sustained military operations deep in French territory. These aren't contingency plans drafted in case of unexpected success. These are comprehensive administrative blueprints for governing conquered territory, complete with transportation networks, communication systems, and economic integration policies. Documents found in East German archives after reunification reveal even more detailed planning for governing occupied Britain. German administrators had developed comprehensive policies for everything from food distribution to educational curricula to judicial systems. The level of preparation proves that German leadership seriously expected to implement these plans. Think about what this means for our understanding of historical possibility. These weren't fantasies or wishful thinking. They were serious governmental preparations for scenarios that German leaders considered achievable with reasonable modifications to existing strategy and tactics. The archaeological evidence extends beyond administrative planning. Military historians discover German engineering projects that would have supported much more extensive offensive operations than anyone realized. Hidden construction sites reveal preparation for railway extensions, ammunition depots, and communication centers, designed to support armies operating hundreds of miles from German territory. But perhaps the most sophisticated analysis comes from complexity science research at the Santa Fe Institute. These researchers use network analysis to map the interconnected systems that determined war outcomes. Instead of treating historical events as linear cause and effect chains, they study them as complex adaptive systems, where small changes in seemingly unimportant areas can trigger massive systemic shifts. Their models reveal that World War I represented what complexity scientists call a critical point, a moment when multiple systems were balanced on the edge of major transitions. Railway scheduling, weather, patterns, disease outbreaks, individual personality conflicts, technological innovations, WC. All of these interacted in ways that created extreme sensitivity to initial conditions. The research demonstrates that history operates more like complex adaptive systems than like mechanical processes. Small changes can produce massive consequences, not because of proportional cause and effect relationships, but because they trigger systemic reorganizations that cascade through interconnected networks. This has profound implications for how we understand historical causation. The traditional approach focuses on identifying major factors that shaped outcomes: economic competition, military technology, political ideology. The complexity science approach reveals how these major factors interacted with smaller variables to produce specific outcomes. Let me give you a concrete example that perfectly illustrates this complexity. Weather patterns during the spring of 1918 affected mud conditions on the Western Front, which influenced the timing and effectiveness of German offensive operations. But weather also affected Atlantic shipping conditions, which influenced the success of submarine warfare campaigns. And shipping conditions affected food supplies in Britain, which influenced civilian morale and political support for continuing the war. Traditional historical analysis might treat these as separate factors. Complexity science reveals them as interconnected elements of a single dynamic system. Change the weather patterns, and you potentially change outcomes across multiple domains simultaneously. The mathematical modeling reveals something even more remarkable. the sensitivity of historical outcomes to variables that nobody at the time recognized as important. Slight differences in disease transmission rates affected troop availability at crucial moments. Minor variations in industrial production schedules influenced ammunition supplies during key battles. Small changes in communication technology affected coordination between different military units. None of these variables seemed crucial to people living through the events. Military leaders focused on major strategic decisions. Political leaders concentrated on alliance relationships and diplomatic negotiations. Economic leaders emphasized industrial capacity and resource allocation. But mathematical analysis reveals that the accumulation of small variations in seemingly minor areas could have been decisive. History balanced on knife edges that nobody at the time even recognized as knife edges. Here's what really gets me excited about this research. It's being applied to contemporary challenges in ways that provide practical benefits for current decision-making. Climate scientists use similar modeling techniques to project multiple possible future scenarios. Instead of trying to predict exactly what will happen, they analyze the range of possible outcomes and the factors that might influence which scenarios actually develop. Urban planners employ comparable approaches to design cities that can adapt to various demographic and economic changes. Rather than planning for a single expected future, they create flexible systems that can function effectively under multiple possible conditions. Military strategists apply these frameworks to prepare for conflicts that may never occur, but whose possibility shapes current preparations. Business leaders use similar analytical tools to develop strategies that remain effective across various possible market conditions. The research methods pioneered for alternative history analysis are revolutionizing how we approach planning and decision-making in situations characterized by high uncertainty and complex interactions between multiple variables. But perhaps the most important contribution of this research involves what historians call epistemic humility. Recognition that our knowledge and assumptions about how the world works remain incomplete and potentially incorrect. The German victory scenario reminds us that the patterns we observe in international relations, economic systems, and social organization represent just one possible way of organizing human societies. The technological developments, political institutions, and cultural values we consider normal or inevitable emerged from specific circumstances that could have developed differently. This perspective encourages openness to different approaches, while helping us avoid the trap of assuming that current arrangements represent optimal or permanent solutions to human challenges. Understanding how different the world could have been helps us think more creatively about how it might become different in the future. The complexity science research reveals something even more profound: the importance of maintaining multiple possible strategies rather than committing completely to single approaches. In complex adaptive systems, the most successful strategies often involve maintaining flexibility and preparedness for multiple possible scenarios rather than optimizing for single expected outcomes. This applies to everything from personal career planning to business strategy to international diplomacy. But here's what really captures my imagination about all this research. It's still advancing rapidly, with new discoveries emerging regularly. Recent developments in artificial intelligence enable much more sophisticated modeling of historical processes. Machine learning algorithms can identify patterns in historical data that human researchers might miss. Neural networks can simulate human decision-making processes under various stress conditions. Quantum computing may soon enable analysis of historical scenarios with unprecedented complexity and precision. The mathematical tools being developed for studying alternative histories will become increasingly powerful and sophisticated. Next time, we're going to explore why understanding these impossible worlds matters for navigating our current moment of rapid global change and uncertainty. We'll see how the methods developed for analyzing German victory scenarios help us recognize tipping points in contemporary international relations, how they provide tools for business and policy planning, and why they're essential for maintaining what researchers call epistemic humility in an uncertain world. The story of why these impossible worlds matter today is our final chapter. and it's going to show you how studying the past that never was helps us navigate the future that's still being determined. Here we are at the end of our incredible journey through the world that never was, and I want to talk about something that might be the most important part of this entire story. Why does any of this matter? Why should understanding a German victory that never happened help us navigate the challenges we face today? The answer is going to change how you think about everything from international relations to career planning to the daily decisions that shape your life. Because studying alternative histories doesn't just tell us about the past, it provides essential tools for understanding the present and preparing for the future. Let me start with something that's happening right now, as we speak. Picture the current global situation. China's rise challenging American dominance, Europe struggling with internal divisions, technological changes reshaping entire industries, climate change creating new forms of international cooperation and conflict. Sound familiar? These are exactly the kinds of rapid systemic transformations that the German victory scenario would have produced a century ago. The methods developed for analyzing alternative histories help us recognize when seemingly stable situations might be approaching tipping points. Just like World War I represented what complexity scientists call a critical point, where small changes could trigger massive transformations, our current moment shows similar characteristics. Business leaders are already using analytical frameworks derived from alternative history research to prepare for multiple possible futures. Instead of trying to predict exactly what will happen, which is impossible in complex systems, they develop strategies that remain effective across various scenarios. Take the technology industry, for example. Companies like Google and Microsoft don't just plan for the most likely technological developments, SSE. They prepare for multiple possible futures, where artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and biotechnology might evolve along different paths. The scenario planning techniques they use derive directly from methods developed for studying historical alternatives. But let me tell you about something even more immediate and practical. The German victory scenario reveals how quickly international systems can collapse and reorganize around new power centers. This understanding proves crucial as we watch current global dynamics unfold. China's economic rise, America's relative decline, Europe's struggles with unity, the emergence of new regional powers. Traditional international relations theory often assumes that power transitions happen gradually and predictably. But the alternative history research shows that systemic changes can occur with stunning rapidity when multiple factors align. The British Empire's potential collapse in the German victory scenario would have happened within just a few years, not the decades that characterized its actual decline. This has profound implications for contemporary policy planning. Instead of assuming that current international arrangements will persist indefinitely, planners need to prepare for the possibility of rapid systemic reorganizations. The alliance structures we take for granted, the economic relationships we consider permanent, the technological balances we assume will continue. All of these rest on foundations that might be more fragile than we recognize. Here's something that really gets me excited about applying this research to current challenges. It helps us maintain what researchers call epistemic humility. Think about all the things we assume are inevitable about the modern world. The spread of democracy, the growth of international law, the expansion of human rights, the development of global markets, the advancement of technology. We often treat these as natural progressions that were bound to happen. But studying alternative histories reveals that none of these represented predetermined trajectories. They emerged from specific circumstances that could have developed very differently. Democracy might never have spread beyond a few countries. International law might have evolved along completely different principles. Human rights concepts might have taken forms we wouldn't recognize. This perspective encourages openness to different approaches, while helping us avoid the trap of assuming that current arrangements represent optimal or permanent solutions to human challenges. It makes us more creative and flexible in thinking about how to address contemporary problems. Let me give you a concrete example of how this works in practice. Climate change represents exactly the kind of complex, interconnected challenge that benefits from alternative scenario analysis. Traditional approaches focus on predicting specific outcomes: ZO, temperature increases, sea level rise, economic impacts. But complexity science approaches, developed for studying historical alternatives, reveal that climate systems might respond to human activities in ways that aren't captured by linear projections. Small changes in feedback loops could trigger massive systemic shifts. Technological breakthroughs might alter development trajectories in unexpected ways. Political responses might create international cooperation or conflict patterns that reshape global governance systems. Climate scientists now use scenario planning techniques derived from alternative history research to explore multiple possible futures, rather than trying to predict single outcomes. This helps policymakers prepare for uncertainty, rather than betting everything on specific predictions that might prove incorrect. The same principles apply to personal decision-making in an era of rapid change. Career planning provides a perfect example. Traditional approaches suggest choosing a field and developing expertise in specific skills. But alternative scenario thinking reveals that entire industries might emerge or disappear much faster than people expect. The technological developments we explored in the German victory scenario, OPAR, rockets reaching space in the 1930s, synthetic materials revolutionizing industry in the 1920s, remind us that innovation timelines can be much more compressed than they appear from historical distance. Artificial intelligence, biotechnology, quantum computing, renewable energy. Any of these fields might develop along trajectories that create entirely new career opportunities while making current specializations obsolete. Alternative scenario thinking helps people prepare for multiple possible futures, rather than betting everything on specific predictions about technological development. But here's what really captures my imagination about applying this research to contemporary challenges. It reveals the importance of maintaining flexibility and adaptability, rather than committing completely to single strategies. In the German victory scenario, the most successful individuals and organizations would have been those that could adapt quickly to changing circumstances. Traditional British merchants who rigidly followed established trading patterns would have been displaced by entrepreneurs who recognized new opportunities in German-dominated markets. Similarly, in our era, the current moment of rapid change, the most successful strategies often involve maintaining multiple options rather than optimizing for single expected outcomes. This applies to everything from investment planning to international diplomacy to technological development. Educational systems provide another fascinating application of alternative scenario thinking. Traditional education assumes that students should master specific bodies of knowledge and develop particular skills that will remain valuable throughout their careers. But alternative scenario analysis suggests that the most important capabilities might be learning how to learn, adapting to changing circumstances, and thinking creatively about multiple possible futures. The cosmopolitan education systems that would have emerged in the German victory scenario, AAT, with multiple languages, international perspectives, and exposure to diverse cultural approaches, .pose. Provide models for preparing students for uncertainty, rather than for partnering specific predicted futures. Modern educational reformers are already implementing approaches derived from alternative scenario thinking. Instead of focusing exclusively on current subject matter divisions, they emphasize cross-disciplinary thinking, cultural adaptability, and creative problem-solving that remain valuable across multiple possible futures. Let me tell you about the implications for international cooperation and conflict resolution. The German victory scenario demonstrates that stable international systems can emerge from configurations that seem impossible from the perspective of existing arrangements. German-dominated Europe cooperating with American-led Western Hemisphere, Ottoman territories thriving under German protection, African development proceeding along entirely different patterns. SAA, these arrangements might have created more peaceful and prosperous conditions than what actually developed. Contemporary international challenges, 2I, trade disputes, technological competition, climate cooperation, pandemic response, SME, might benefit from thinking beyond existing institutional frameworks. Instead of assuming that current international organizations represent optimal approaches, Alternative scenario thinking encourages experimentation with different forms of cooperation. The European Union provides an interesting example. Its development represented exactly the kind of creative institutional innovation that alternative scenario thinking encourages. Instead of accepting traditional nation-state competition as inevitable, European leaders created new forms of cooperation that had never existed before. Similar innovations might be needed to address current global challenges: climate change, technological governance, economic inequality, pandemic prevention, OCTI. All of these might require international cooperation mechanisms that don't yet exist, and that might seem impossible from the perspective of current arrangements. But here's what really excites me about the practical applications of this research. It's already being used to address some of the most important challenges facing humanity. Medical researchers use scenario planning techniques to prepare for multiple possible disease outbreak patterns. Instead of planning only for the most likely scenarios, they develop response capabilities that remain effective across various possible pandemic developments. Urban planners apply alternative scenario thinking to design cities that can adapt to various demographic, economic, and environmental changes. Rather than assuming specific growth patterns, they create flexible infrastructure that functions effectively under multiple possible conditions. Military strategists employ these frameworks to prepare for conflicts that may never occur, but whose possibility shapes current defense planning. Business leaders use similar analytical tools to develop strategies that remain profitable across various possible market conditions. The research methods pioneered for alternative history analysis are revolutionizing how we approach planning and decision-making in any situation characterized by high uncertainty and complex interactions between multiple variables. Perhaps most importantly, studying alternative histories helps us recognize the contingent nature of current achievements while maintaining confidence in human agency and creativity. The spread of democracy, the development of human rights, the growth of international cooperation, the advancement of technology, PT. All of these represent remarkable human achievements that weren't inevitable, but emerged from specific choices made by individuals and communities facing uncertain circumstances. Understanding how different the world could have been helps us appreciate how much human effort and creativity went into creating the positive developments we now take for granted. It also reminds us that continued progress requires ongoing effort and imagination rather than passive reliance on assumed historical trends. The German victory scenario reveals both the fragility and the resilience of human civilization. Political systems that seem permanent can collapse rapidly when underlying conditions change. But human creativity and adaptability enable the development of new arrangements that might be more effective than what existed before. This perspective proves especially valuable for young people growing up in an era of rapid change and uncertainty. Instead of feeling overwhelmed by the pace of transformation, they can develop confidence in their ability to adapt and contribute to positive developments, regardless of how current systems evolve. As we conclude this incredible journey through the world that never was, I want you to think about something profound. Everything we've explored, every detail of this alternative timeline, every technological breakthrough that might have happened decades earlier, every political movement that never emerged, every cultural transformation that could have reshaped human civilization, all of it represents possibilities that remain relevant for understanding our current moment. The tools developed for analyzing these alternatives help us navigate contemporary uncertainty with greater creativity and confidence. The perspectives gained from studying how different the world could have been enhance our appreciation for current achievements while inspiring continued innovation and improvement. Most importantly, understanding alternative histories reminds us that the future remains open to human agency and imagination. The patterns we observe today, the institutions we inhabit, the technologies we use, the relationships we maintain, all of these represent just one possible configuration of human possibility. The world that never was teaches us that the world that might yet be remains full of potential for positive transformation. And that might be the most important lesson of all. The choices we make today, like those crucial 11 decisions that could have changed the entire course of the 20th century, might shape the trajectory of human development for generations to come. Understanding how much individual and collective choices matter, NGO, even in the midst of massive historical forces, empowers us to approach current challenges with both humility and confidence. The story of what if Germany had won World War I ultimately becomes a story about human possibility itself, and that's a story that's still being written, with each of us contributing to how it unfolds. Thank you for joining me on this incredible journey through the world that never was. I hope it changes how you think about the world that is, and inspires you to help create the world that might yet be.